How to Read a Magic the Gathering Keyword. Episode 1, First Strike. In the simplest of terms, creatures with First Strike deal damage before creatures without First Strike. That said, it would be more accurate to say, if at least one creature participating in combat has First Strike, there is an additional combat damage step where First Strike creatures deal damage before the normal combat damage step where the remaining creatures deal damage. Let's break that down. A creature deals damage to a creature by marking its power as damage onto that creature, to a planeswalker by removing its power in loyalty from that planeswalker, and to a player by subtracting its power from that player's life total. After damage has been dealt in a combat damage step, any creatures marked with lethal damage, namely more damage than their current toughness, are destroyed along with any planeswalkers with 0 remaining loyalty counters. As there are 2 combat damage steps when at least one participating creature has First Strike, creatures could be destroyed in the first combat damage step and, therefore, not deal combat damage at all. To illustrate, if a 2/2 attacks and is blocked by a 2/1 with First Strike, the 2/1 with First Strike will mark 2 damage onto the 2/2 during the first combat damage step. As this is lethal damage for the 2/2, it will be destroyed during the first combat damage step, and not have the opportunity to deal damage in the second combat damage step. The results of the first combat damage step could also impact the board state during the second combat damage step in other ways, too. Consider that continuous effects on permanents that were destroyed will no longer apply, or the results of triggered effects being resolved. Worth mentioning, any players with 0 or fewer life points after the first combat damage step would also be eliminated from the game, along with all of their cards, before the second combat damage step begins, which could also impact the board state, at least in multiplayer games. That said, during the second combat damage step, any creatures without First Strike that survived the first combat damage step will deal damage as normal. As such, if a 1/3 attacks and is blocked by that 2/1 with First Strike, the 2/1 with First Strike will mark non-lethal damage onto the 1/3 during the first combat damage step. Both survive to the second combat damage step, but during the second combat damage step, only the 1/3 will deal its damage. As such, the 1/3 will survive combat and the 2/1 with First Strike will be destroyed. A related keyword ability, often mentioned in the rules related to First Strike, is Double Strike. Without getting into too much detail, creatures with Double Strike deal damage in both the first and second combat damage steps. So, at the beginning of the video, it would have been more accurate for me to have said, if at least one creature participating in combat has First Strike or Double Strike, there is an additional combat damage step, where First Strike and Double Strike creatures deal their damage before the normal combat damage step, where the rest of the creatures and the creatures with Double Strike deal their damage. As long as they survive the first combat damage step, creatures with Double Strike can, effectively, deal twice their power in damage. For instance, if a 2/3 with Double Strike attacks and is blocked by a 3/4, in the first combat damage step, the 2/3 with Double Strike will mark 2 damage on the 3/4, while the 3/4 will not mark any damage. As neither creature have lethal damage marked at this point, both will survive until the second combat damage step. In the second combat damage step, the 2/3 with Double Strike will mark an additional 2 damage on the 3/4, while the 3/4 will also mark its 3 damage in power onto the 2/3 with Double Strike. Both creatures would be marked with lethal damage at this point and be destroyed. As it seems is the case with everything in Magic the Gathering, even this detailed explanation doesn't take into account every complication that could be introduced by other game effects. For example, creatures could gain or lose First Strike or Double Strike, or join or leave combat during either combat damage step. While these edge cases are covered in the Magic the Gathering's comprehensive rules, here's a few highlights. While players cannot cast spells or activate abilities between combat damage being assigned, combat damage being marked on creatures, and creatures marked with lethal damage being destroyed, players do have the opportunity to take such actions at the end of the first combat damage step before the second combat damage step begins. Yes, you can ninjutsu away a creature with First Strike after it has dealt damage in the first combat damage step, and have the ninjutsu creature deal damage in the second combat damage step. No, First Strike and Double Strike do not apply to fight effects. No, a creature who had First Strike in the first combat damage step, but no longer has First Strike in the second combat damage step, does not deal combat damage in the second combat damage step, unless it happens to have Double Strike during the second combat damage step. Thanks for watching.